past was pretty rough. Now, the future is definitely ill-defined. Do you want things to be better? Or do you want things to be worse? Convention is part of the wisdom of mankind, the standard path through life. If you can't see the sense in it, then you're not approaching it properly, or you have bad teachers, or you don't know how to read, or something like that. Why do humans enjoy sad stories? That's Alex Viander. Well, I don't know if they actually enjoyed them. Although I think you could make a case that they do. We're compelled to understand the tragedies of our life. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Why? If we change our behavior in the present, better things could happen in the future. Well, no other animal really has ever discovered that. Okay, so that's very tightly linked into the idea of sacrifice. You could try revolting against your lack of discipline. Like, that's good, that's a war. That's a war. If you want a war, maybe you do, because people need war. If you want to revolt, you should revolt against your own pathology and inadequacy and uselessness and resentment and cruelty and blindness, and yeah, you could have a war against that. You could revolt against that. That'd give you something to do. What's happening to you is horrible, but it's precisely this kind of horrible, and here's what this kind of horrible is like, and here's what you can do about it, and here's a bunch of other people who are also suffering from it, and they've recovered. And so with this kind of horrible, there's all these other things that you won't have to worry about. And that's really, that can be really helpful for people. Shame isn't, no emotion is always destructive. Any emotion taken to an extreme can be destructive. People who are manic are in some sense possessed by a radical excess of positive emotion, and they get incredibly impulsive. And it's terribly destructive. I mean, there's almost no form of insanity that's more destructive than mania. People will go out and spend all their money, all their family's money, and, well, and engage in all sorts of hyper-optimistic interactions with the world. It will result in their complete ruin. And shame is like if you do something stupid and destructive to yourself, or to yourself and the broader social community. You should feel shame, and you should pay attention to it, and you should learn from it. How should you decide between being hard on yourself and giving yourself a break? That's a very good question. You shouldn't work so hard that you can't continue to work that hard. What you have to learn is, how can you maximize your productivity? And often that means learning actually how much work you can do, and how much leisure you need, and how much you need to involve yourself in activities that are outside of work. I would say for young people, the way that you figure that out is that you pick something difficult to do and you work yourself half to death doing it, so that you can figure out where your actual limits are, like your limits of psychological and physiological endurance. And once you've exceeded your limits, to pull back to the point where that becomes sustainable. Sometimes, I think, to do the right thing, you're required to break a law and be punished for it. I think you can find what compels you and what might enable you to live in a high-quality manner despite the suffering that's associated with life. I think you can discover that, and I think part of the way you discover that is by watching yourself and learning when it is that you're meaningfully engaged. You have to notice that. It's something that happens to you in some sense rather than something that you do. You have to notice when you're meaningfully engaged. And then you have to work to expand the amount of time that you spend in that state. But I would also say that there are moral requirements that go along with that too, because you might say, well, what if you happen to be the sort of person, for example, who finds torturing small animals meaningfully engaging? It seems like that's the sort of meaningful engagement that you probably don't want to expand. So I would say that if you're going to set up your life so that you maximize your meaningful engagement, there's a number of other things that you have to do at the same time. And one of those is that you have to get very clear about who you are and what you're doing. And so, although this would be grounds for a much longer discussion, I think that one of the things that you have to do if you're going to attempt to maximize meaningful engagement is that you also have to do such things as endeavor to stop deceiving yourself and other people in every way you possibly can. And part of the reason for that is that if you engage in deception of any sort, you pathologize the structure, well, first the structure of your being, but you could say you pathologize the structure of your nervous system, and then you can't trust its reports. So if you're going to rely on your nervous system's reports of meaningful engagement to guide your future activities, you better do everything you can to make sure that you're not filling that nervous system with the kind of garbage that's going to make it malfunction and give you false reports. So I think that moving towards meaningful engagement has to be associated with making truth your highest value, because otherwise you can't trust yourself as your own guide.
Really good to see all of you. There are people from all over the world here, London and Vancouver, and let's see, where else are you guys from? Well, Toronto, that's not quite as exciting since I live here. Quebec, Calgary, Edmonton, Vienna, Boston, Auckland, New Zealand, Montreal, Texas. There we go. Morocco, Netherlands. Yeah, it's amazing that this can happen like that, as far as I'm concerned. So, okay, first question. What is your advice for finding a sane, sound therapist? Well, I would say with regards to finding a sane and sound therapist, there's some practical things you can do. I guess this is more relevant if you live in North America, and I'm not sure exactly what the training requirements are in other places in the world, but your best bet, I would say, is to find someone who's appropriately trained, and I would regard someone who's appropriately trained as a psychotherapist to be someone who's, I think you're safer if you go with someone who's trained at one of the big research schools and you have a therapist who's well versed in psychotherapeutic practice, but who's also sufficiently educated scientifically to be able to understand the scientific literature. And you can be pretty certain of that if you find a therapist who's got their PhD rather than a PsyD. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with PsyDs. If they received their PhD from an American Psychological Association approved school of clinical psychology. And those schools operate under what's called the Boulder model, and the Boulder model promotes what's it called? Science practitioner as the optimal ideal combination for a psychotherapist. So someone who's trained psychotherapeutically, but also has research experience and can understand the relevant scientific literature as it pertains to mental health. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is, go to see a psychotherapist once and maybe go to see a couple of them and find someone that listens to you, because the psychotherapist shouldn't be someone who solves your problems for you or offers you advice, although sometimes that can be helpful. Really what the psychotherapist should do is be someone who can help you understand what problem it is that you're facing so that can be delineated properly, to help you articulate what it is that you want, so what your vision of mental health might be and what you'd like to attain in psychotherapy, and then who helps you strategize towards that end. And so you want someone who will really listen to you, that you feel comfortable telling the truth to, because that's also incredibly important. You have to if you can't tell your psychotherapist the truth, then you're not going to get anywhere in therapy, because you won't be able to actually outline the nature of your fundamental problems. So that's vital. And go see someone and see if you're happy with the way that you're interacting with them. That's the most relevant issue. I think it's difficult to work with a therapist who is less intelligent than you are. That's kind of a rough way of conceptualizing it, but a lot of what a therapist does is help you strategize, and the person has to be able to think analytically and probably at least to some degree with the same degree of complexity that you're capable of. It's not necessarily a good idea to be able to outthink your therapist. So was there ever a time when you saw a therapist of some kind? Well, no, actually, I haven't ever seen a therapist, and that might seem strange, I suppose, given that I am a psychologist. I don't really like talking about my problems with other people, as it turns out. I'd rather keep them to myself. And but I would say, having said that, is that I've read an awful lot of the writings of the great clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, and I would say that I've used them as psychotherapeutic aids, and I think that plays a very similar role, or that can play a very similar role. I need another question. Sometimes you have to draw a line in the sand before people are willing to undergo the serious self-consideration that would precede any real transformation. Some practical advice is, well, regulate your habits. Try to get up at approximately the same time each morning. I would recommend that you get up approximately when other people get up, so that would be something in the neighborhood of 7:30 or 8 in the morning, or perhaps earlier, perhaps a little bit later, but you want to stabilize that because your circadian rhythms operate more, what would you call it, fluidly, and your mood is likely to be regulated better if there's islands of stability in your daily routines. Human beings like daily routines, just like dogs like daily routines. And so regulate your sleep. I would say when you get up in the morning, eat breakfast. That's a really important thing to do. I can't tell you how many people I've treated in my clinical practice whose proclivity for emotional instability and depression, anxiety, general hopelessness, emotional pain and gloom and doom, as well as capacity to concentrate, were properly regulated or inhibited or reduced by merely ensuring that they ate I would say a protein and fat rich breakfast relatively soon after they wake up. And that's especially true if they're stressed. And because it turns out that if you stress yourself after a fast, which is of course what you've undertaken if you haven't eaten since the night before, that your body produces enough insulin to deplete deplete the sugar in your blood, and then it's very difficult for you to become regulated properly with regards to your metabolism until you sleep again. And so it can be regulating your sleep, and your breakfast eating habits in particular can be in a very effective way of regulating your mood and increasing your capacity to concentrate. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, that it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. So maybe what you do, you say, okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplished, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. And then practice incrementally, day by day, trying to inculcate the habits that you want to inculcate. And assume that it'll take you a number of months or even a number of years in order to become very fluent at the habit. The important thing is to start improving incrementally, because incremental improvement pays off like compound interest. And so I would also say that the trajectory that you're on is more important than your starting point. And that's also an extraordinarily optimistic observation, because it means that direction is more important than current position. And I mean, current position matters, obviously, but I don't think it does matter as much as direction. So if you want to learn to concentrate more, define what constitutes concentration. Break it into micro habits, and then start practicing instantiation of those micro habits. You know, if you're scared of going to parties, or maybe scared of going out in public, you can also always go to the nearest bar for 10 minutes and sit there and have a drink and then leave, you know, and then maybe expand that up to 12 minutes, and then maybe dare at one point when you go out to say hi to someone. But again, don't ever underestimate the utility of incremental improvement. You can get a tremendous distance by engaging in incremental improvement. My gut instinct, and I would use this as a good rule of thumb, is to assume ignorance or error or stupidity before you assume malevolence. What would you recommend to someone who wants to try to be productive in their free time but always gets sucked in by video games and other distractions? Well, I would say define more carefully precisely what you mean by productive. So get a plan in order, delineate the plan down to the level of a daily routine, set up a daily routine using a calendar, put in times that you're going to get sucked in by video games and other distractions, because obviously you enjoy that, and then set yourself up so that it's difficult to get access to those things. So that's the answer to that question. If it's relatively straightforward social anxiety, exposure therapy is very useful for that sort of thing, and sometimes social skills training if you don't feel that you have the skill and wherewithal to conduct yourself appropriately in a social environment. And some people weren't socialized very well, and so they don't have those skills, or they didn't get the opportunity to practice. I would say what's probably more important is that you find a therapist that you're comfortable with and who is pushing you and helping you and listening to you in the proper manner. But behavioral therapy is very, very effective for relatively straightforward issues of anxiety and skill deficit, let's say. How old was I when everything you understood started to come together? I think that really started happening to me. It started probably happening to me when I was in my early 20s. I think the most important realization I had, and I outlined this realization in my book, in the preface of my book, Maps of Meaning, that I realized at about that age that almost everything I said was a falsehood of one form or another. It was either I was using language instrumentally in order to win arguments, or to attain dominance, or to indicate that I was intelligent, or to use it for victory, for narrow, local, personal victory. And I realized that when I was in my early 20s, and I started to, because a voice started inside my head, which I now regard as something equivalent to the cricket in Pinocchio, and it basically continually informed me that the things I was saying weren't, in some fundamental sense, weren't true. And it was very disquieting, because the voice that was commenting on what I was saying was making comments of that sort. I wouldn't call them disparaging voices. It was more just a matter-of-fact commentary. But it was saying it about 95% of what I was saying. And I thought, well, that's a strange conundrum, because now I don't know if I'm the voice that's criticizing what I'm saying, or if I'm the thing that's saying what's being criticized. How do you figure that out? But I decided that I would take a chance and assume that the part that was suggesting that I wasn't saying things truthfully was accurate, and I started to practice only saying things that voice wouldn't object to. And I think that's also equivalent to some degree to trying to say only those things that make you strong instead of weak, or that make you that do not fill you with a post-speech sense of shame and regret. And I really think that was the beginning of all of this. About this, it was at the same time, though, that I was starting to work on the problem that I think has obsessed my entire life, which is, what's the pathway between nihilism and totalitarianism? Like, is there a genuine pathway between those two pathological extremes? So, and I think those things wove together. I had a serious problem to solve, and I also tried to begin to sort out my language, and really to learn how to work as well. So, and that was in my early 20s. I mean, I had lots of things to straighten out in my life, many things, and I still have many things to straighten out in my life. But I think that's it. So, whenever you ask a question and the question is of the form, is X equal to Y, the answer is always, it depends on how you define X and it depends on how you define Y. Let's see. Jordan, Dr. Peterson, will you visit Fredericton, New Brunswick? I have visited Fredericton. I actually had quite a nice time there. I'm going to try to limit my travel to about once every 6 weeks because I have a bunch of other obligations that I have to keep up with. And at the moment, Fredericton isn't on my travel schedule. I am releasing a book in the early part of 2018. It's called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And it's 12 essays that I derived from a set of answers that I gave on the website Quora to the question, what are the most valuable things that everyone should know? What are the most valuable things that everyone should know? I think I wrote 42 little rules there. And you can find them at jordanbpeterson.com. They're accompanied by photographic images that one of my viewers has kindly donated to the project. People have been doing all sorts of nice and creative things for me, helping me facilitate what I'm doing on YouTube, and they did that. The reason I mention that is because I presume that when that book is released that I'll be going on a speaking tour, and it's possible that Fredericton would be on that agenda, but I don't know because none of that has been formulated yet. So the book, I'm happy with the book. I've been writing it for about 3 years, and it's been quite thoroughly edited and commented on by my editor. Penguin Random House is publishing it in Canada, and I've had a number of friends of mine who are good authors and sometimes excellent authors review it, and so that should give me the opportunity to do some more traveling and to talk about the book. So, okay, 80% of humanities papers garner 0 citations, which means essentially that no one reads them, or if they do, they don't do anything with them. Someone says, I made the mistake of using psychedelic and recreational drugs to excess when I was young, and I'm sorry, I can't see the question right now, so I'm going to have to regenerate it from memory. And the consequence of that, I believe, is that my ability to think has become very cloudy and uncertain. And I don't know what to do about that. I would say that you should probably go talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, because there are maybe things that could be done to sharpen your thinking up again. And maybe some of them, perversely enough, might be pharmacological. Perhaps, what you're describing could be a consequence of something like depression or even post-traumatic stress disorder. So, because the evidence on the long-term use of psychedelic drugs, for example, doesn't indicate that overall they produce negative health consequences of the sort that you're describing. Now, you might have had adulterated drugs, you might have been one of those people, and there do seem to be people like that who are prone to negative consequences for using various recreational drugs. But I would say, if you really think that your cognitive ability has been impaired, you should probably go talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist and see if you can do something about that, because sometimes, for example, antidepressants or drugs like Wellbutrin, which is also an antidepressant but a different kind, can be very useful in restoring mental clarity. It's worth a shot, You don't want to go through life like that. So, okay. Nietzsche made the proposition that he said that morality is cowardice. Now, that's not exactly what he said. What he said in a more elaborated form is that very frequently people are afraid to do things, and they're often things that other people regard as bad, and because they don't want to admit to themselves that the reason they won't do those things that are regarded as bad is because they're cowardly, they pretend that it's because they're moral. And so often conventional morality is a consequence of conventional cowardice. And the problem with conventional cowardice is that it's not sufficient to solve serious problems. And so, for example, it's necessary for a man, and perhaps for a woman as well, to become a bit of a monster, or even a lot of a monster, in order to move through life successfully. And that doesn't mean precisely that you have to act out being a monster, but it means that you need to be able to be a monster when the circumstances demand it. And so the reason that anti-heroes like Walter White, for example, are so popular in American culture is because the criminal Walter White was in no obvious way less moral than the conventional and cowardly Walter White. Now, you might say he went from one extreme to another, which he did. But it's also the case that in order to expand past the domains of conventional morality / cowardice from the Nietzschean perspective, it's necessary to incorporate elements of the shadow. And that's in some sense what Nietzsche meant when he said that we need to go beyond good and evil. And it's certainly what Jung meant when he said that it's necessary for someone who wants to burst forth from the potentially pathological confines of their conventional persona into the journey towards individuation and the development of the self, was that the shadow had to be incorporated. And that means often, in part, the capacity for aggression, the capacity for sexual expression, the capacity to defy convention, the capacity to take your own road. And that's all predicated on the development of an inner relationship with the monster. And it's the same idea that's expressed in Harry Potter. Harry Potter is actually able to combat Voldemort, who's essentially Satan for all intents and purposes, because he has a piece of evil lodged firmly within him. And it's also what makes him a redeeming rule breaker, right? So the anti-hero is the shadow, roughly speaking. And the shadow is the thing that the persona needs to incorporate to become the hero. All right, so I'm going to sign out here pretty quick because I'm starting to wear out and I don't want to say anything pathologically idiotic for public consumption. And that could happen, and that would be a bad thing. So, okay, so let's see. I'll answer one more question. You get better at things by doing them somewhat badly to begin with. So, anyways, thanks very much. I'll see some of you again in a month, and over and out. And thanks to Julian very much for helping me sort this out and set it up. Good night. Other one. Now, I don't remember, who was I? Oh, yes, that's all about cleaning your room. Yes, exactly. So, well, the thing is that your room isn't not you. It's actually you. And so there's no difference between the chaos that's outside of you in a place that you spend as much time as you spend in your room and the chaos that's internal psychologically. And, you know, one of the things I often do when I'm first dealing with my clients as a simple exercise in setting themselves right psychologically is to have them start to clean up their external environment. I've often thought this about the Jews too, is that if you're going to be a minority, you should at least have the decency to fail. If you leave a back door open, man, you're going to use it, that's for sure. What's my advice? Well, the first piece of advice probably would be don't pretend that it's not important. You sacrifice your autonomy by not being able to drive. Look, Kenny, I would say take a driver's course and do it badly. Who cares if you have to do it 5 times? You know, go sit in a car for a while and pretend to drive like you're a kid, and then have them drive you around the block and take it slow. Maybe it's something that'll take you a whole year to learn. Make a schedule. The first week of classes, put in your exams, like in Google Calendar. Put in your assignments. Make a plan to get the assignments done. Start early, because lots of kids end up by Thanksgiving, their first semester, and they get so damn far behind they can't believe it, because there's a lot of work in university, a lot of reading. I don't know the answer to that. What should I do if every time I voluntarily confront my problems I get too overwhelmed with stress to make progress solving them? That's a good one, man. Okay, so the first thing is take your problems. Let's take the driving example. I'm too afraid to drive. Okay, then you think, well, what exactly does driving consist of? Well, the first thing is that you have to establish some kind of relationship with a car. So you might think, well, you're not too afraid to go online and do a little investigation into what cars are like what's a good car and how do they work, and, you know, familiarize yourself with the car, and then that makes you a little less afraid. And then you think, well, Maybe I'll just go sit out in a car and put my hands on the steering wheel and, just kind of accustom myself to the idea of being in the car and accustom myself in my imagination to drive around in the car. Maybe I'll try some driving simulators online. And then the next thing is, well, maybe I can find someone I can trust to train me. And what we'll do is, as I mentioned earlier, is we'll go out to an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning and I'll drive 15 feet and then stop, and that'll be good enough for the day. So what you want to do if you're overwhelmed with your problems is you want to break the problems down, and you do this by thinking strategically. You want to break the problems down into units that are small enough so that you can confront them and master them with a high degree of probability. And you can decompose almost every stressful problem into, so imagine that you have a stack of paper on your desk and there's a bunch of monsters inside it that you don't want to face, like homework you haven't done, or taxes that you haven't finished, or trouble you're having with a bureaucratic enterprise that you'd rather avoid. It's like one of the things you can do is just the first day you might think, okay, Jesus, I want to avoid that. All right, well, would I be willing to take the papers downstairs and put them on the table and spend no more than 10 minutes just looking at them and organizing them? And you might then you ask yourself, well, would I do that? And if the answer is yes, you think, okay, that'll be good enough for today. And then the thing is, you've knocked on the dragon's door, and you've eliminated the first part of the avoidance. And so then you're on your way. And the next day you might think, well, could I deal with the first page of that problem? And you think, well, I could at least look at it. And the trick is, and this is what behavioral psychologists do all the time, is identify the fear, break it down into its subcomponents, lay out a schedule for confronting the subcomponents, and don't burden yourself more than you can tolerate. And man, you can make unbelievable progress that way. But you have to be willing to give yourself credit for small achievements. And that's fine, because consistent small achievements add up incrementally across time into absolutely remarkable progress, because you start to get like compound interest on it. So yeah, so that's what you should do. And look, if that doesn't work and you're so overwhelmed that you're just absolutely in stasis, then one of the things that you should consider is that maybe you have an anxiety disorder, maybe you're depressed, like maybe things have just really collapsed in on you and you have terrible problems, like maybe you're sick and you have an ill relative and you're in real financial trouble and you're unemployed. It's like, that's just too much. And so at that point, maybe you need to go talk to someone, and maybe you need to consider something like temporary anti-anxiety medication or antidepressant medication, and to sit down and strategize with someone about how you're going to put your life back on track. And I would say also, if you're in a situation like that and you can't find a therapist, then try the self-authoring program, because that's what we designed it for. You have the opportunity to learn how to be grateful that you're not starving to death in a ditch, and it's not such a bad thing to start at the bottom, because then you learn what the bottom is like and you learn how to move forward. You need to find someone that you can talk to, that you trust, that's wise. And maybe that'll be a professional. It's often the case that people are terrified about the terrible things that might happen is because they won't really think through what the terrible things are and what they would do. And so think it through, think the catastrophe through, and think about how you would cope with it if it happened. And that should encourage you to some degree. Look, I know people need to eat, and I know that they need security and all of that. I understand that. Start ridiculously, pathetically. Study for 5 minutes a day for a week, and then move it to 10. You'll be able to do that. And don't cheat, because one of the things people do is they make a deal with themselves like that. I'm going to study for 10 minutes a day, each day. And then they get into it and they think, wow, this is going really good. So they study for 2 hours, and then they've broken the contract with themselves and they don't trust themselves anymore. And then they don't study for a whole year, or, well, maybe not, for a month. So, but set your contract. Ask yourself, what could I do to move myself forward to my goal that I would do? And then how could I improve that incrementally? So that's the right way of going about that. So, okay. There's something to be said for doing what grips you, but you have to ally that with discipline. Do you have any guidance around taking notes from books and lectures? Yeah, no problem. Like, don't be taking notes during the lecture exactly, because then you're not listening to the lecture. It's like, listen to the lecture and then take notes afterwards. Now, that doesn't work for every discipline. You can take notes afterwards because what that does is force you to practice remembering. Read, think, write. Or read, write, think. Because the last two things are quite similar. But don't like read the book and then read a sentence and then write down that sentence. That's not helpful. You could read the sentence, close the book, and then reformulate the sentence so that now it's your sentence, man. Then you'll remember it. Then you'll understand it. That works really well. There is an infinite number of ways to perceive the world. The idea that the world is so complex that there is, in principle, an infinite number of ways to perceive it is correct. I had a client, very introverted person, very badly served by her parents, not very well socialized, extremely socially anxious, awkward in her social interactions as well, so not skilled. And also alone. She didn't have an intimate relationship or really any family, so quite isolated person and terrified of social interactions. Like, she couldn't even go out and have a coffee with me as her therapist as a practice exercise when we first met. And man, she's made progress like you wouldn't believe, like unbelievable progress. Doing public appearances on stage even. Go to Toastmasters, do some public speaking, join meetup.com, ask people questions. That's a really good thing. If you're not very social and you get self-conscious, you start thinking about yourself and how stupid you are, that's a really bad idea. You should be paying attention to the other person. So if you get nervous, it isn't that you have to stop being nervous, because that isn't going to work. What you have to do is start paying more attention to the other person. You have to force your attention outward. And, you can ask people questions. Listen to them. And when they say something interesting or they say something you don't understand, ask them a question. And people love that, man, because they know you're listening to them, and people love being listened to. So if you're nervous, learn to listen better and learn to ask questions. And there's no stupid questions if you're paying attention, right? And so you don't have to worry about that. If you don't know something, and you ask an honest question and someone treats you badly because of it, then you should just go away from that person because they don't have a clue. So get out there. Forget about trying to not be nervous, because you're going to be nervous. But when you're nervous, pay more attention to other people. Listen to them carefully. Watch them, because then your natural social abilities will kick in, and ask them questions. And, you'll assume it'll take you 3 or 4 years to get decently good at it, and that you'll really have to work at it. But it's worth it, man. So just go out there and do it, and you'll figure it out. You'll figure it out. Education in the humanities is designed to teach you how to think and to speak and to formulate arguments. The proper use of a schedule enables you to have the maximum amount of freedom while also maintaining the responsibility necessary to stop your life from auguring into the ground. If you aim at something and you aim carefully and thoughtfully, that you will orient yourself in a manner that makes you aware of the opportunities that will arise that will put you in that direction. Someone asks, how do you find the self-authoring autobiography outline? Well, you go to selfauthoring.com. It's available there. You get older than 40, and our culture is kind of dopey in that regards. It's underdeveloped. We live as if we only exist when we're young, and we don't. It's like, what are you going to do from the ages of, say, 45 to 90 or 95? You need a family around you. You need to see your children grow. You need to have grandchildren. It's a major part, maybe the most important part of the last half of life. Instead of doing a bad job, even though that's a very interesting question, I'm afraid I'm going to skip that. Out of such imaginings, what is it that you are offering people as a concrete alternative? It degenerates as soon as it becomes cynical. I think many times the moral thing to do is to take your guilty secrets to the grave. You've considered such things as, do you have a sufficient number of joint interests, and are you oriented in the same direction with regards to how you're going to handle your joint careers and the possibility of children and the manner in which you're going to interact with your in-laws. Who's responsible for the meals and when, and what are you going to eat, and who's going to get groceries, and who's going to pay the bills, and who's going to do which part of what household chores there are to do, and how is that going to be laid out fair. You have the rope and strand of your life, and your partner has the strands and the rope of his or her life, and then those are tied together to make a stronger rope. A lot of what you do to formulate good questions is listen. Like if you're engaged in dialogue with someone and you really listen to what they're saying, all you have to do is notice when you don't understand what they're saying and then ask them for a clarification. What you do to formulate good questions is admit your own ignorance to yourself and then try to articulate that ignorance as clearly and simply as you possibly can. And so I do that all the time when I'm in my clinical sessions with people, because they'll be telling me the story of their life years ago perhaps, or maybe events over the last few weeks or whatever, and they'll tell me the story and I'll detect elements of it that I don't understand or that are unclear or that seem self-contradictory. And so then I'll just ask. It says, well, I don't understand what you're saying there. You said this as far as I can tell, but that wasn't clear. What exactly do you mean? And so a huge, and get them to articulate it. And maybe I'll say, well, you said this now, but you said this, 10 minutes ago. And as far as I can tell, those two things are opposites. And so how do you bridge the gap between those things? But the critical issue with regards to good questions is that you admit to yourself your own ignorance and you're not embarrassed about it. Like, there's nothing wrong with being ignorant. Well, that's not true. It's a terrible thing to be ignorant, but it's inevitable. The students who do really well in classes are the ones who ask basic questions. They put up their hand and say, look, everyone else here seems to understand this, but this is a point that I really don't get. And, rarely a person asks a question like that and they haven't been listening and they haven't been paying attention and they're just being annoying. But most of the time, people who do that have been paying attention and they're asking a question that everyone else in the room would also like to ask but is embarrassed to do so. You're going to be resentful and bitter in many situations because you don't get what you want. And if you watch that resentment and bitterness, you'll see that it produces fantasies that can be unbelievably dark. They want to live in this wish fulfillment fantasy where everybody can have all the sex they want all the time, and it's always wonderful and no one gets hurt. And it's like, sorry, that just doesn't work in the real world. And I've had a variety of very strange experiences that have convinced me that we know very little about anything. You won't be able to maintain a positive relationship with your parents if you do so at the cost of your own destiny. Did I fail any classes in university? I had to retake stats. I wasn't good at stats. I got it eventually. 225 pounds isn't bad. Yeah, well, I only weighed 160, so, it was pretty good. But it was funny because it was only one day I was able to manage that. I could do 200 with a fair bit of regularity in a bench press, but one day, man, I did 205 and that worked, and I did 210 and that worked, and I got all the way to 225 and I was never able to duplicate it again. So that was pretty interesting. They're just going to write you off because it's easier than taking you seriously. If you take a rat, lab rat, typical lab rat is, genetically bred to be identical with many other lab rats, and he lives alone in a cage, and he's got a pretty miserable rat life because rats are social animals and they don't like to live in cages by themselves. And you can get a lab rat in a cage addicted to cocaine in no time flat, and he'll like press a lever for cocaine reward, pretty much to the exclusion of all else, including sex and often including food. But if you take that same rat and you put him in a rat family, in a rat social hierarchy, in a rat environment, and give him something that rat like to do so that he can be satisfied, it's very difficult to get him addicted to cocaine. We have a problem of meaningful engagement. I know it's expensive, but so is not having a life. Find someone you can talk to, and then make it, and someone practical, probably a behavioral therapist would be best, and then have them set goals with you and help you strategize to stay on track week to week. That's the best thing, or to set that up with a friend if you can't do it with a therapist. My brother is a soldier in Iraq. As a clinical psychologist, what should one do when coming from such a chaotic place back to a tame and structured one? Well, I guess that would depend to some degree on exactly the nature of his experiences in Iraq. So it's hard for me to elaborate on that further. mean, I would say, though, that one thing he could really do, and this is somewhat self-serving, or could appear to be somewhat self-serving, I suppose, is I would strongly recommend that your brother do the self-authoring suite when he comes back, because it'll help him, and probably concentrate on the future authoring program to begin with, because it might take a while when he gets back before he can meditate on his experiences without that meditation being harmful. So, for example, there's pretty good evidence if you've had a traumatic experience that you shouldn't re-subject yourself to the traumatic experience repeatedly before, say, about 18 months or something like that is passed. And it isn't exactly obvious why that's the case, but there's a pretty good literature indicating that it is. So I would say that when he makes the transition from Iraq back to normative society, that the first thing he should do is generate a plan, a plan about how he would, and this would be the same even if you were coming out of something like prison, or making a change, a radical change in your occupation, is you need a plan, right? You need a plan so that you can because you can't just make that adjustment without knowing what you're doing. So that's what I would recommend. And if he does come back traumatized, then I would say, traumatized soldiers often have to develop a very comprehensive philosophy of good and evil, and so that would either mean perhaps talking to a decent clinical psychologist about what his experiences were, or perhaps reading some of the literature. And I've outlined those books on my website at jordanbpeterson.com that can be really helpful in understanding, in helping someone understand the evils of atrocity and warfare. I'm going to talk about something that happened to the comic book character Superman in the late 70s. So Superman was extraordinarily popular from the 1930s right up to the 1970s. But one of the things that happened is that as he became more and more popular, he also got more and more powerful, right? So by the 80s, Christ, you could bounce a hydrogen bomb off Superman's chest and he could juggle planets. And, that's all well and good, except what kind of adventure is he going to have? There's only a certain number of things you can do with the chessboard and the chessmen. You want to develop your web of connections, your social network, and of course you want to do that in any enterprise, right? So it's a challenge for introverts in general. Loki Doodle says, I cleaned my room finally. That's good. I hope that it has a pronounced positive effect on the rest of your life. When I cleaned my room this weekend, it made it easier for me to finish this chapter that I've been obsessing about. So that was quite interesting. So, cleaning and organizing your room is no joke. It's a great meditative exercise, especially if you take it seriously. And you're not trying to make it look neat, although that's not a bad aim. You're trying to turn the room into somewhere that the person you want to be could live. Put yourself together and prevail. We can certainly advance in the direction of our imagination. You have to think through how your life could be valuable without alcohol. Often people go all or nothing, just like they do when they're quitting cigarettes, and they'll quit for a month and then have a cigarette, and they'll say, oh my God, now I've broken the pact, and then they'll smoke a whole pack and they'll be smoking again. You don't have to do that. You can just decide that you slipped and that you're going to get back on the wagon again. Waves of contempt for existence itself keep coming. Well, I guess what I would say is it's probably time for a little bit of individual psychoanalysis, and I don't necessarily mean that you have to go and find a therapist. You say waves of contempt for existence itself keep coming, but I don't believe that that's exactly right, and I'm certainly not accusing you of being deceitful. I might recommend trying the past authoring program. You can kind of tell if something needs work from a memory perspective if it occurred more than about 18 months ago, and when you remember it, it still causes like a wave of sadness or anger or really any kind of negative emotion. I would say you try to shed all your personal resentment. Part of that too is to not take things too personally. There's nothing personal about the fact that terrible things happen to you. I mean, unless you're directly causally involved, as it says, I believe in the Old Testament, rains on the just and the unjust alike. And what's the vision exactly? I mean, is it the destruction of the town? Is it the destruction of the country? Do you want the entire world to blow up? Or are there specific people that you're angry at, or maybe you're angry at yourself? You need to figure out those waves of contempt. How's the online personality test coming along? Can't wait for it. Well, it's coming along pretty well. We have all the reports written, and we have the
the underlying computer architecture finished, and at the moment we're just polishing it up, essentially, and we're hoping that you'll be able to get a very detailed description of all 5 of the big 5 traits, right? Extroversion, that's a positive emotion dimension. That will break down into enthusiasm and assertiveness. And neuroticism, that breaks down into withdrawal. Like if you're in a state of withdrawal, then you're frozen with fear and don't want to do anything. You're afraid to go out. You're afraid to engage in any complex task because you might fail. You'll doubt yourself intensely. That's withdrawal in neuroticism. And then volatility is that kind of impulsive touchiness that people often develop when they're in a bad mood, where if you reach your finger out to touch them, they'll flinch and maybe slap you, and they're oversensitive to small slights and they don't have much of a sense of humor. And agreeableness, that subdivides into compassion and politeness, and the liberal types are more compassionate, and the conservative types are more polite, and politeness seems to be something like acting in accordance with the social norms governing interpersonal interaction, whereas compassion seems to be the proclivity to side with the weakest party, something like that. And I think it's the primary maternal dimension, because the perhaps along with higher levels of negative emotion, because it's obviously the case that when you're dealing with children, especially infants, that you should take the side of the weaker party pretty much no matter what the logical argument is, right? Because an infant who's crying is always right, especially if it's under a year old. There's no logic to it. It's an a priori fact that a crying infant is correct. And so we don't know how that translates into the political sphere, because the most direct translation would be a complaining person is always right. And, I see that manifesting itself, I would say, quite clearly in the politically correct domain, is that you always side with the person who's manifesting negative emotion. And you always assume that there's an external reason that needs to be rectified in order to deal with that. And, it isn't obvious to me that agreeableness as an ethic is something that's transformable into the political or the adult landscape. But, we don't know these sorts of things, and we can't even talk about them because people automatically assume that that's sexist or misogynistic, or even though, there are agreeable men as well as agreeable women, because men are quite maternal for the kind of large apes and mammals that we are. But we need to take these sorts of things seriously, because it isn't obvious to me that an ethic of agreeableness can govern a complex polity. It looks to me more like conscientiousness is something that needs to govern arm's length transactions and that sort of thing, rather than treating everyone like kin, which you just can't do because you don't have the energy. Anyways, the test will also associate assess conscientiousness. That's orderliness, which seems to be associated with disgust sensitivity and is a good predictor of conservative belief. And industriousness, which is something like it's what it says exactly. It's the proclivity to engage in effortful work towards a defined goal in a reliable manner, and it's the second best predictor of long-term life success after IQ. And then the final thing it'll assess is openness to experience, which is more or less half creativity and half interest in ideas. And so if you take the test, you'll get about a 10-page report, and it's quite detailed, and it tells you where you fit on a percentile basis and what your strengths and weaknesses are going to be as a consequence. And Benjamin Wood says, my room is a den of iniquity. Well, congratulations, that's not an easy thing to pull off. I guess you might be asking yourself, what's that's doing for you? Obviously you're being funny, and that's just fine. So what advice would you give to someone looking to quit porn? Well, I gave some advice a little earlier about quitting alcohol, and I would say it isn't that you're trying to quit porn. It's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that you're trying to figure out how to have a better life. Decide if that's the pathway through life on which you wish to travel. And so, and then I would also say good luck to you. You know, it's a very good idea to identify one of your weaknesses and work on it. You can strengthen yourself substantially by doing that. Don't underestimate the significance of the birth control pill. It's like the hydrogen bomb or the computer chip. It's a world revolutionary technology, and for all we know, it might do us in. You know, I mean, in the West, the birth rate is far below replacement, and you know that's as a multi-generational strategy. That's an absolute dead end. When people float and drift, they usually don't float somewhere good, and they usually drift somewhere bad. I am beginning to sort myself out thanks to you. Well, I'm very glad to hear that. I have a question about scheduling your time. Trying to make a schedule in a chaotic job with constantly changing shifts and hours. Tips, or should I find a new job altogether? Well, you know, I can't answer that, Josh, because I don't know enough about the details of your life. But what I would say, and maybe you've tried this already, is, you know, try to make 2 plans, okay? Because when you're trying to think something like this through, you need to think it through in detail. And so, one plan would be how you would conduct your life optimally and organize your time if you kept your current job, and you want to make that as acceptable and positive as possible, and then make out another plan where you shift jobs and you have, you know, maybe a more stable working arrangement, and then think about what your life would be like if you had that. And then, because you've laid out a detailed map of both, you're in a much better position to compare them. And so, you know, you might need to talk to somebody about that too, but that's what I would recommend, because it's just too complicated a job. Like if you find that your sleep is chronically disrupted and you can't organize your life, the fact that shift change is no trivial thing, and it can really throw your mood regulation for a loop too. And I don't know if that's happening to you or not, but that's also something else that's worth taking into consideration. But I would say map out an alternative reality where you don't have those problems and see how much better that looks. You know, I presume there's some advantages to your current job. So, and it also depends on what your options are. Like, how hard would it be for you to find another job? And could you find a job, like maybe the best thing to do would be to try to find a job that's better, that doesn't have shifts, you know, and maybe that'll take you a year or two. That can be very difficult, but you know, a year or two is a shorter period of time often than it seems. So that's what I would recommend. So nothing motivates me aside from eating and sleeping. I lie in my bed all day, not on my computer, not on my phone, not doing anything. I just lie there thinking, what's happening to me? I would say that you are, and this is not a diagnostic comment, and I don't know enough about you to provide that sort of information, but I would recommend that you see a therapist and be screened for depression, because that's what it looks like to me. And I would say that if it's depression, you should do something about it, because depression is very hard on people. It produces a lot of stress hormones like cortisol, and that can hurt you. And you know, if it's only been a couple of days, I wouldn't worry about it. But if it's a chronic pattern, then you should go talk to somebody, even your family doctor. You know, and there's always the possibility that a low dose of an antidepressant might be worth trying. You'd know in a month if it fixed you. But I would say don't stay in that situation, man. Go find out. Do whatever you have to get out of it. And especially the fact that you're not on your computer, not on your phone, not doing anything. You know, you're ruminating. That's just lying there thinking. That's loops of negative emotion. And you don't have any positive emotion, you know. That's why you're not on your computer or your phone. And so one of the characteristics of depression, or I suppose 2 of the characteristics, is a decrease in positive motivation. And so that means that you're not interested in anything, and an increase in negative emotion. And that can manifest itself in that just lying there thinking, you know. So go talk to someone. Go talk to someone. Tell someone that this is happening. Get to your family doctor. Let them know what's happening. Get them to give you a depression screening, and see what you can do about it, because there are effective treatments for depression, and sometimes antidepressants work like a absolute charm. I want to be more connected to people, but part of me can't get myself to care. Okay, well, one of the things that so maybe you're a little bit on the disagreeable side. That's a possibility. There's some interesting clinical evidence that suggests that one of the things that disagreeable people can do in order to facilitate their interactions with other people is to do people favors. And so what you might say is that you could start by acting like you care, and then maybe you could learn how to care through doing that. So maybe you could say, well, I'm going to do something nice for someone once every 2 days for a month, and think about it a little bit and see if that changes you, because sometimes you think yourself into change, and sometimes you act yourself into changing your thoughts. And so that's what I would start by doing. And you could also be more connected to people regardless of whether you care. Let's say that it would take you 6 months of practice or even a year of practice before you cared. But that's not so long, especially if you're young. So that's what I would say about that. There's a good series of social psychology experiments that show, like, imagine that you bring someone into a lab and you have them write an essay about or fill out a questionnaire about their political opinions, so you get a baseline measure of their political stance, and then you ask them to write 1,000 words, maybe they identify as right-wing, and then you get them to write 1,000-word essay on why a particular left-wing position is true. And then you have them come back in 2 weeks and you give them the same political belief questionnaire. They'll have shifted quite radically towards the left. And the reason for that is that people don't think through their positions in great detail. And so if you get them to think through a contrary position in great detail, then that starts to become more convincing. Don't make unnecessary enemies. So you might be have fallen so far inside yourself that it's very difficult to get out. Do you plan your day much, or your time generally? Does this lead to higher productivity? Yes, I plan my day obsessively. My calendar is always absolutely full, and often weeks in advance. And I plan in the morning, especially when I'm on top of things. And I plan each hour, and I probably plan each minute. And yes, it leads to way higher productivity. You decide what your goals are going to be. You place them in the calendar. Use the calendar as your friend, because what you want to do with the calendar is design a day that you want to have, or a day that would be good for you. And a day that would be good for you is one that you're when you end the day, you feel that you've moved yourself ahead towards your valued goals, and that you've kept chaos under control, and that enables you to sleep soundly and with a good conscience, and to know that the next day is going to be at least not worse than that day. If you're avoiding something, you could schedule in 5 minutes of it and say, well, like if you're avoiding looking at some bills because you're afraid of them, your first step might be to schedule in 5 minutes where you just look at the bill. You don't do anything else. Responsibilities are those things that ruin your life if you don't fulfill them. It's a lot easier to engage in activities that aren't intrinsically rewarding if they're linked to something that you really find important, because you don't want to fall too far down a hole, that's for sure. One of the things that we've learned as clinicians say is that when you help people overcome anxiety, it isn't that you make them less anxious necessarily when you're young and your life is ahead of you. That's the last time that you need to be nihilistic and cynical. You can tell that when you drink, you get alert and let's say more enthusiastic and energetic, and then you don't want to stop drinking. That's definitely a bad sign with regards to developing alcoholism. You go out voluntarily and start to confront the things you're afraid of. So for example, if you're afraid of the mall, maybe you go to the parking lot and you look at the mall, and then you walk close to the door and you look inside, and then you go home, because that's enough for one day. But you do progressive exposure, and that's one of the basic rules of psychotherapy, is that if you're afraid of something, you progressively and voluntarily expose yourself to it. And that generally, it's the voluntary exposure that's curative, right? You'll find that you get braver, and you learn that you can tolerate the fear. And as each person reflects the entire crowd back to you, I don't think that that'll be the biggest problem that you'll face. Break it down into small steps, and then practice each step until you're bored with the step. And when you're bored with it, that means you're no longer anxious about it. And don't quit. like stick at it, because it's really useful to overcome a fear. And once you've identified a fear, then you've identified something to overcome that can definitely make you stronger. There was a kid years ago at the University of Texas at Austin who climbed up on the tower there and shot a number of people with a high-powered rifle, and he had a fast-growing tumor on his hypothalamus and had reported like these being overcome with extreme feelings of rage. You tend to saw off the branch that you're sitting on a regular basis. I would repeat what I said earlier. I think that one of the things that you do if you're high in anxiety is to stabilize your sleep-wake cycles. So get up at the same time, go to bed at the same time, and eat at the same time. Make sure that you eat breakfast, and a big breakfast too, that's heavy on fat and protein. It isn't obvious why things grip you and shake you like a rat, I guess there's something about that seems to be associated with what people used to call destiny. Thuggestrike. I've heard depressed people who stopped antidepressants said they never helped in the first place. What do you say to that, Mr. Peterson? Hey, that's certainly possible. Antidepressants don't necessarily work for everyone. My personal opinion is that antidepressants work quite well for many people whose lives are in decent order. So they have friends, they have family that love them, they have a career, they're educated approximately to the level of their intelligence, they have things to look forward to. But for some reason their mood is extremely distorted and negative. And I've seen antidepressants have miraculous effects on people like that. I think they're less likely to work when people have a plethora of life problems, which isn't exactly the same thing as being depressed. Having a terrible life is not the same thing as being depressed, although the two can overlap. And it isn't obvious to me that people who, maybe they have a drinking problem or a drug abuse problem and they're unemployed and they have a pathological family and their friends aren't good for them and, they have a string of failures behind them and they don't have much to look forward to in the future and all that. It's a lot for an antidepressant to overcome, but under those circumstances, maybe the antidepressants can help stave off feelings of like suicidal feelings and that sort of thing. But antidepressants don't work for everyone. But some people they work really well for, and if you're depressed, they're definitely worth a try. In a month if they're going to work. Also, there are a variety of different kinds of antidepressants, and you have to figure out dose, and you have to figure out when you should take them during the day, and you have to figure out type. So they're not a cure, they're a tool for helping control negative emotion, and they can be very effective. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people that they didn't help. So that's what I would say about that. Seaman Eric says, apologies for the weird question. Have you ever performed a ritual sacrifice? No, I haven't. And it is a weird question, although I can understand why you would ask it. I've seen people go from being afraid to strike up to have a conversation with a friend in a coffee shop, like have a panic attack thinking about that, to actually doing stand-up comedy. So you need at least 90 minutes a week to think about where you want things to be going in the medium to long term. I've found many times in my life that you have to be aware of what you are judgmental about. Imagine that you're designing your schedule so that you can have the life you want. Just start with that, and be easy on yourself to begin with. You'll get better at it. You can add more responsibilities as you practice. I think that Adderall is an amphetamine. It is addictive. It can sensitize you to other dopamine agonists. So I would generally say it's something to be avoided. You also want to really watch it in combination with marijuana, for example, or psychedelics, because you can get unlucky and trigger a psychotic episode. And go do the future authoring program. That's a good start. And you'll have to learn how to schedule your time and how to get up at the same time every day. And it's going to be a real struggle. Walk through your fears.
Attention really plays a huge role in regulating anxiety. Good intentions are only the beginning. Maybe you're rowing in circles, or maybe you're just standing still. Look, let's try this for 6 months and just see how it goes. Trey says, how can a person go through the future authoring process of imagining a future for yourself as though you are someone you care about when you barely don't care about yourself or even hate yourself? You know, sometimes you have to act something out before you can start to believe it. And so I would say sit down and pretend that you're your friend. You know, Trey, the probability that there's something so wrong with you that you don't deserve any regard whatsoever is zero, you know. So, and I would say if you just can't get it together, you know, maybe you're depressed. You hear about these idiot savants. There's a lot of ways to be really smart, but there's only one way to be not very smart. If there's 1,500 people in a room, like 15 of them are going to be completely out of their mind. Probably more like 30, but at least 15. What is the evolutionary reason for having consciousness? I think that was Toby who asked that. Transphobia, bigotry, racism, what else? Oh, fascism. It takes people, unless they're very young, it takes people about a year to adjust to a really radical change, like to move to a new city, to adjust to being married. That can take longer than a year. To adjust to having a new baby, to getting over a relatively serious loss like a death in the family, a year. You have to give yourself time to adapt, and you can't expect that that's going to happen overnight. Things to love, things to eat, things to run away from, things to run towards. What I can tell you is that almost nothing beats listening. You know, like take a kid for a walk, let him talk, like listen to him, ask him questions, you know, because most disturbed people, and maybe even most people, don't actually have anyone they can talk to. As a beginning counselor, the best thing you can do is listen. You don't want to give advice, really, you know, because what you want, you can ask questions that might lead someone in an advisable direction. But the problem with giving advice is that people are much more likely to remember something and to implement it if they've thought it up in their own words. Try to lead by example and see how that works. You might have to go out to a movie after you haven't been good to each other for like 5 years. She seems healthy and, you know, she's cute as can be. Of course, babies are sneaky that way. I constantly cannot verbalize my thoughts, written and vocal, regardless of topic and my level of knowledge. Tips for verbalizing thoughts to get them into writing and therefore speech. Well, what I would say, Lauren, is do this, like read something, put it aside, try to summarize it in writing, and talk while you're doing it, and then write down what you say. And don't edit while you're doing that. See, one of the problems that people have when they're trying to write is they try to write a good sentence. They not only try to write a sentence, but they try to write a good sentence. And you can't do that. You have to write a sentence. That's hard enough. And then you have to edit it. So allow yourself to write badly. I'm dead serious about this. Like write a bad first draft. And then edit it. If you get rid of 70% of it, so what? That's exactly what should happen. So like if you want to write a 1,000-word essay, you should start by writing a really bad 2,000-word essay. And then you should get rid of the worst 50%. Let yourself be bad at it. You'll get better as you practice. What is your plan if YouTube deletes your account? I caused as much trouble as I possibly could. I write about this in my book too, by the way. That's the best I can do without having more information about the specifics of your situation. You have a situation that you know you haven't mastered. Define the situation repeatedly. Define your proper action repeatedly. Practice implementing that in your imagination, and then start to do that in your real life.
Should artists waste their time in art school? No, you shouldn't waste your time ever. 1,000 of them are going to be completely out of their minds. You know, it's like, have you stopped beating your wife yet? It's like, how are you going to answer a question like that? You lose either way. There's the necessity to forego immediate gratification for the purpose of medium to long-term thriving, let's say. You got to watch your child and don't stop them from exploring things that they need to explore. You can grab them by the leg and say no, and no, no, and wait until they give up. Usually they'll cry, and then you can let them go. And then soon, if you do that about 10 times, soon then if you just say no with the same tone of voice, the child will, generally what happens, the child will immediately cry and then stop. And then after about 10 repeats of no without having the leg grabbed, then no will just produce stopping of the behavior. Say, look, you sit there until you're ready to listen. If that becomes a game, then you sit on the step and you hold him by the arms. Remember, no anger, because he's just 2, for God's sake. You know, you don't have to be angry. Just put him on the steps and hold him. Say, look, I'm not letting you go until you sit there and behave. You can outwait him if you're patient, but you got to make the time. I was wondering what your thoughts are on meditation and if you practice it yourself. Well, that's a good question. I think I practice it a lot. It's a bad idea to lie. Now, but I don't think it's a bad idea to play pretend games with your children. I think that's okay. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday rather than to who someone else is today. 40-year-olds are really different from each other, and so are 30-year-olds for that matter. You don't have to beat yourself any more than is necessary for you to learn, which is a good rule of thumb with regards to treating yourself and also to treating other people. I don't think my wife loves our internationally adopted daughter. Was she in on... Failure is a lot easier than success, plus you can complain about it and whine about it and treat yourself with dignity and respect. At least the dignity and respect due someone who's faulty that could conceivably learn. It's easier to beat yourself continually on the back of the head with a club. Maybe they'll be able to ask you for help if you do that. Maybe you shouldn't respond immediately even though you're very irritated. The third time they do it, then you think, no, 3 times, that's a pattern. This happened, and then maybe they deny it, and you say, well, yeah, you can deny it, but then this happened, and maybe they deny it, and you can say, well, you can deny that, but then this happened. You've got teeth, and you could really use them in an underhanded and horrible way. Hate you, and don't like you, and think you're trash, and so forth. You don't trust people. This whole not trusting people isn't working out very well, because now I can't get anywhere. Put yourself out there despite the fact that people might hate you, and don't like you, and think you're trash. If you went out and talked to people, you'd find that those thoughts only bothered you for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then you would get over them. If you find yourself avoiding social situations, then you have to formulate a plan to stop doing that. Ellen Wilson, how do I tell my half-brother, 14 and 17, their father didn't leave 3 years ago, but that we kicked him out because he was a pedophile who targeted my sister? The older one is autistic. I'm tired of lying. Jesus, Ellen, that's a rough one. I can't tell you. I can't help you. I'd need to know way more details. I can imagine you're tired of lying. The 14-year-old might be a little young. I don't know, Ellen. It's too complicated. I can't come up with a good answer for you. I'm sorry. I'd have to know more details in order not to botch the job. There's kids out there that only have to run into one good adult, and that will set them on a proper course through their life. And you could be that one good adult. There's lots to do. What books ought we read to our young children? Well, it depends on how young. Really young, there's this book called How to Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. It's called How to Teach, something technically poor, your child to read in 100 easy lessons. That is an excellent book because you can actually teach your child to read in 100 easy lessons. Very smart, very, very smart book, very well developed psychologically. Older kids, I really like the Harry Potter books. What else? I'm in collaboration with my daughter, I'm putting together a reading list for young people, for kids and young adults. So I guess I'll have to answer it that way. I can't bring it to mind. I can't bring it to mind. Is the person seeing a counselor? There's lots of potential treatments for depression that have some efficacy, and antidepressants really do work wonders on people. You could try 5-hydroxytryptamine too. You could look that up, 5-HTP. You can also help the depressed person make a plan in the morning. That can be really useful, or maybe a plan the night before if they're just not in any shape to do it in the morning, to sit down and say, okay, well, you have to get through tomorrow. And that's another good piece of advice. And so in Rule 12, I talk about that sometimes in relationship to depression. Rule 12 is pet a cat when you encounter one on the street, and it's a bit of a meditation about what to do when your life is in absolute crisis. But one of the things you can do with someone who's depressed is narrow, and this is what I discuss in this chapter, is narrow their time frame. Maybe a depressed person can't think a week ahead, but maybe they can think about tomorrow, and you can sit down and say, okay, well, you have to get through tomorrow, and so how are we going to structure tomorrow so that it will be okay, and so that you'll be able to sleep reasonably soundly when you go to bed tomorrow night, and then tomorrow night we'll do the same thing. And helping someone come up with a daily plan can be, now they might object and squawk and complain about it. You've got a child coming, that's really something, that's someone that could actually like you. Often, like a new mother can really use help with a baby, could really use help with a baby. So even just being a babysitter, if you were like committed to it and made the real offer, like you'd thought about it, how about think about it for a whole week? It's like, okay, here comes this baby. If I was being a civilized, useful person, but I don't love the mother, then what should I do? Well, you're going to have to ask yourself a lot of questions and maybe talk to some people that you trust. But it's a problem worth solving, because it might be, it's a relationship you could have the rest of your life. Evan says we are expecting our first child in May, a daughter. Any advice specific to raising daughters? Well, congratulations first. So that's great. Let's see. I'm just thinking about my daughter and specific advice. I would say don't be afraid to support her masculine and feminine sides. And so the feminine side is, you'll find little girls, now not all little girls, because some are more masculine than others, but let's say you have a more feminine little girl. She's going to like to dress up. She's going to like to put on jewelry. It's amazing how much of that stuff seems to be implicit or innate. And that can be really supported. But then by the same token, it's nice to wrestle with your little kids, and little kids really like rough and tumble play, and to encourage her to be courageous and forthright. And so if you're lucky, you can support her in both elements of her personality, and that would be a really good thing to do. So don't let her wrap you around her little finger either. That's another thing too. Were there any lectures or lecture series that you found helpful to you? This Nathan, like yours have been to so many. Well, Nathan, I would say not really. Mostly what's been helpful to me have been books. A lot of what you want to do when you meet people is ask them questions, because they'll tell you all sorts of things you don't know, and that's also an entry point to a really good conversation, is to ask questions. Lots of young people have never thought about who it is that they could be if they started to be the person they could be. And so getting them to think about that and write about it would be extremely important. It would really be good in 2018 if a whole bunch of people did everything they could to put their lives together.